title of the lesson versus what the church had. To me, that's the title. And the walls came tumbling down. You know, when you study Joshua, that's the first thing that pops into anybody's mind. The Battle of Jericho. That just pops into your mind. And that's all right, because that was a big key. This is the first real big test for Israel to see if they're going to be faithful when God gives them an unusual plan to follow. And they were faithful. Last week we learned a new word often used by Bible scholars. Does anybody remember what that word was?
It was another word for
Theophany. Does anybody remember what we said a theophany was? A theophany is a manifestation of God in the Bible that is tangible to the human senses. It's that contact we saw, like God in the burning bush, or God as a man standing there talking to Abraham, telling him what was going to happen, or as an angel that spoke to Mary. These are all theophanies, they call them, and he says that's where they speak. It's God's word that is manifested in such a way that it touches one of the human senses, either by sight or by hearing. The Israelites are now camped in Gilgal near Jericho. Joshua is waiting for instructions from God about when and how to attack and conquer the city of Jericho. Now Joshua must have been wondering, how would they be able to conquer this mighty city that was famous for its protective walls? That's the key, is the walls. Let's look at what archaeologists uncovered about the city of Jericho and its famous walls. They've gone back, and the town has been built and destroyed many times, and they've gone back and they've discovered some things about these walls. Now, we're going to use two illustrations to show you some things about the walls that they discovered on these. We're going to take that one on the left and look at it first and see if we can get some dimensions and get a better understanding about the walls. First, there was a retaining wall down at the bottom, and that wall is about 12 to 15 feet tall. Now, when we give you a range, it's because when the wall goes all the way around the city, some places it might be 15, and the lowest point was about 12, and anywhere in between. Then they had what they called a mud brick wall, and it's about 6 foot thick, and it stood 24 feet tall. So, you know, if you're trying to be the enemy and come in and overtake Jericho, and you've got this to deal with. But not only that, you have a second mud brick wall, and it's about 20 to 24 feet tall. Now, the base of that wall is 46 feet above ground level. Let's see how that looks. If you take the base of that top wall and you go all the way down to the bottom down there, that is 46 foot. Now, you remember we said that Joshua, when he had the encounter with a man with a sword, we studied it a couple of weeks ago, it says he wasn't in Gilgal, he had wandered out towards the city. And you can just imagine that he was over there looking at those walls saying, how are we going to do this? Well, you're not going to do it yourself. You're only going to do it with God's help. The distance between the inner wall and the outer wall was anywhere from 40 feet to 100 feet. Because as it went around, some places it was wider, some less. But the smallest distance was about 40 feet between the walls in there. Now, using the other illustration, there were houses that were built between the inner and the outer walls, as well as in some portions of the wall. You remember Rahab, it said, lived in a house that was built within the wall. We read this in Joshua chapter 2. Verse 15, it said, so she let them down by a rope through the window, for what? The house she lived in was part of the city wall. Now, it didn't say if it was the inner or the outer, Me personally, I would just kind of conclude it's probably the outer wall if she's letting the men out, you know, down there. So these walls were thick enough, in some cases there were houses in them. Now, if you go back and study the wall around Jerusalem, you would see the same thing, that there were houses built into the walls all the way around. Now, God gives Joshua some instructions. We'll read that first. Now, the gates of Jericho were securely barred because of the Israelites. No one went out, no one came in. What does that tell us? What do you think it tells? It's your opinion, it's okay.
They're under siege.
Huh?
They're under siege.
Okay. They're under siege, so
They're afraid of the Israelites.
sure, they're afraid of the Israelites. It definitely says that. Yeah. So the gates are closed. Now, I read in one place they estimated there were about 1,200 people that lived in the city, but there were hundreds that lived just outside the walls. And that whenever there was going to be an attack from an enemy, these people would come in to the city inside the walls. They close the gates. No one goes in or out because you don't want the gates to open and the enemies come in. So at this point, right now, God's ready to give Joshua and the Israelites instructions of how to take this city that's now heavily walled and the gates are all closed. Then the Lord said to Joshua, "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men." Didn't say women and children? No, it said the armed men. "Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horn in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priest blowing the trumpets. But when you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have the whole army give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse and the army will go up, everyone straight in." Wow. That was the instructions. If you're Joshua, what are you thinking? Come on, come on. What? Yeah.
Strange.
I would be thinking, you want me to go back and tell all those army men that that's what we're going to do? It would make me nervous. So let's outline what the strategy was here. March around the city each day for 6 days. 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets go ahead of the ark. March around the city 7 times, and on the 7th day, the priest will blow the horns as before. Finally, the priest will give a long blow on the horns, and the whole army will give a shout. The walls will collapse, and the army will go in and take the city of Jericho. Now that's God's plan. He gave it to Joshua. Joshua's got to go back and tell his army, this is the plan. Next, Joshua gives instructions first to the priest of Israel. So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it." That's their instructions right now. Then Joshua gives instructions to the army, and he ordered the army, advance, march around the city with an armed guard going ahead of the ark of the Lord. Now the march actually begins. When Joshua had spoken to the people, the 7 priests, carrying the 7 trumpets before the Lord, went forward, blowing their guard, marched ahead of the priest who blew the trumpets, and the rear guard followed the ark. All this time, the trumpets were sounding. Now Joshua gives the army additional instructions, and they will complete the first day as we read this. But Joshua had commanded the army, do not give a war cry. Do not raise your voices. Do not say a word until the day I tell you to shout. Then shout. So he had the ark of the Lord carried around the city, circling it once. Then the army returned to the camp and spent the night. What do you think the people of Jericho were thinking after that first day was completed? It's an opinion. What do you think?
So those crazy people.
Yeah, that's what I would think. They got to be just like, what is happening? But remember, they've also heard about the Ark of the Covenant, and that scares them too, because they've heard about the Exodus and all the battles that they fought and won, and they see this Ark of the Covenant going by, and they think, oh man, they've got to be afraid.
I have a question. Do you know how far it was
No,
around?
I looked for that and I couldn't find it. That's a good
Because
question.
I keep thinking,
I didn't
you know,
see it anywhere.
No.
I think there were some estimates, but they're so far apart that nobody really understood. You know, they're excavating and they're finding parts of it, but not necessarily all of that wall, so they don't really know. So, same way about the population. They come up with this thing that it looked like there may be 1,200 people in there, but by the time it went doubled even, by the time those from the outside came
It's gotta be big to
in.
hold that many people.
Huh?
It's gotta be big to hold that many people.
Yeah,
To
yeah.
go about their days.
Well, and I think about just in between the walls, how many people between the inner wall and the outer wall, and then those that have houses in the wall, then you get into the city. So, yeah, it is a pretty big place. So now the people of Jericho, I can just imagine everybody fighting to get a position on the wall to look down and see what's happening. And thinking, oh my gosh, oh. Unlike Charlie, they probably thought, they're crazy. Now, the march continues on day 2, and is repeated for 6 days. So they completed one. So let's read the scripture. Joshua got up early the next morning, and the priests took the Ark of the Covenant. The 7 priests carrying the 7 trumpets went forward, marching before the Ark of the Lord and blowing the trumpets. The armed men went ahead of them, and in the rear guard followed the Ark of the Lord, while the trumpets kept sounding. So on the second day, they marched around the city and returned to camp. Then it says they did this for 6 days. What do you think the army felt like, the Israeli army people felt like after doing this 6 days? They're going home and go to their wife and their family. You know, we did it again. I don't know what we're doing, or do you think they had faith in God?
I think
We
they
don't
had
know that answer, but it's a good possibility if they remembered all the battles that they won, if they can remember the parting of the Jordan River right there and seeing that, they got to believe that. It's a strange thing God is having us to do, but I think they have faith because they did it. They did it.
Well,
That's right, that's because they did it.
They
The
did it.
next day they did it again,
Yeah,
several times.
and
Ken.
You can bet in any army, there's gonna be somebody grappling.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's
except,
gonna be some of them grappling about walking around.
Well, I'm sure that is, yeah. But I think overall, the one that gripes is saying, but I'm not going to be the one to stay home either, so I'm going. Yes.
except after the parting of the Jordan, the Bible said that they had great respect and faith in Joshua.
They did. They did. And that's
So
what
they accepted him as they had Moses. And therefore, I think their faith might have been grounded.
I think their faith was good. But I'm like Ken, I think in any crowd there's going to be some that's going to be doubting. I can have faith in God that I know what he's doing with Larry, but I still think, oh my gosh, why couldn't you let him stay longer sometimes? You know, so we can have faith and still kind of withdraw sometimes, yes.
Well, when they sent the 12 spies in and only Joshua and Caleb came back with a good report, the other one didn't, And I guess the story got out that what happens when you don't do what God says to, so
Well, that's
maybe
true.
this time they was
Yeah.
afraid not to.
You think they learned their lesson from that one, maybe?
Now, man, the
All
old
those,
people
all
passed the
those men
stories down.
of that age at that time died out in the wilderness, and so they raised up a new generation. You know, they didn't have any Bibles to read. They had to have these festivals and feasts enough so where they would demonstrate what has gone on all this time. So, okay, they did this for 6 days, it said. Now, day 7. On the 7th day, they got up at daybreak, and they marched around the city 7 times in the same manner, except that on that day, they circled the city 7 times. The 7th time around, when the priests sounded the trumpet blast, Joshua commanded the army, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Joshua didn't say, "We've got the city." He said, "The Lord giveth the city." The city and all that is in it are to be devoted to the Lord. Only Rahab the prostitute and all who are with her in her house shall be spared, because she hid the spies that we sent. But keep away from the devoted things. Here's a warning to these army men. Keep away from the devoted things, so that you will not bring about your own destruction by taking any of them. Otherwise, you will make the camp of Israel liable to destruction and bring trouble on it. All the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are sacred to the Lord, and they must go into his treasury. Now, there's some real instructions here for these to follow. So, did you notice that Joshua gave instructions to the army to spare the lives of Rahab and all who is in her household? So he did not forget his promise that was made through the spies when she saved them over there. Also, all the silver, gold, bronze, and iron items were to be put into the treasury of the Lord. Later, they would be warned not to keep any of these items. Now, Israel takes the city of Jericho, killing all the men, the women, young and old, cattle, sheep, donkeys. That was God's instructions. A lot of people say, "Why would God have you do that?" I could not be a soldier in that army and kill a baby. I'm not even sure I could kill a woman or a man. I don't know. That's hard. That was instructions. They say, how can God do that? Well, he can do that because he was going to destroy the Canaanites anyway, because they were worshiping false gods. So instead of just bringing fire down from heaven and destroy them, he's going to put Israel to the test and say, you do it. This is going to be your land, but you're going to do it and possess it the way I tell you to. Hard. Yes.
That was the norm anyway for those
Yes, it
days.
was.
I guess so. I guess so. It's hard to imagine for us, isn't it?
Yeah, but if you were a civilian, and even if you did escape the first onslaught, you were sold into slavery. So there was no, mercy to civilians probably didn't start until the Middle Ages or later.
Yeah. Yeah, the times were different then. I guess they view things differently than we would view them today.
And that's part of the terror that everybody had, because they knew that was certain death.
Yeah. Yes.
Also, I guess we kind of get the idea about what they're doing because of the Vietnam War. No, our military will have bombs strapped to them. They had to kill it, and they thought how bad we were. So
Yeah, that did go on them. When the trumpets sounded, the army shouted. And at the sound of the trumpet, when the men gave a loud shout, the walls collapsed. So everyone charged straight in, and they took the city. They devoted the city to the Lord, and destroyed with the sword every living thing in it, men and women, young and old, cattle, sheep, and donkeys. I noticed they skipped the word children. I'm glad they did in that, and said men and women, young and old. Just helps me, I don't know if it helped you, but I'm glad they didn't say and children.
I've got a question.
Yeah.
I've always read where they stormed in and they took the city. Wouldn't the Canaanites, wouldn't they be armed? I mean, did that mean they're
Oh, yeah, I would
just
assume
didn't
that,
work?
yes,
I
they would
mean,
fight for their
stand
lives
there
too.
Holding a sword and it,
No, I mean, they just lay there, they didn't lay down and say, go ahead and kill me, I'm sure they fought.
but
But you remember their first battle they ever had when they crossed the Red Sea? It was against Amalek. And Amalek, those soldiers, I mean, they were prepared and they had all kinds of good weapons and stuff, and the Israelites had very little, just what they could take with them when they escaped. But when Moses held the rod of God over his head, the Israelites won. When he lowered it down, they were losing, weren't they? So it's God that makes them win. Did they give a fight? I'm sure they did.
well, and it doesn't say that any of the Israelites were killed.
No, it doesn't say that. No.
So I guess it was a,
And the walls came tumbling down. The sound's not working on this TV right here, so it's going to be a sound that's going to come up. I thought I'd just throw this in here. And so if you're quiet, you can hear this. It's just too cute not to show it. And the children remember this song. I remember that song.
as soon as you
How many of you
started-
remember that song?
as soon as
Yeah,
you
nearly
started
everybody.
talking about it, that song came to
Right.
I got a couple of those.
There's the walls. There goes the wall. They sing pretty good, don't they?
They do.
They really do. I just thought we'd do that. I said, even the children in our church today, they all know about Joshua and the walls of Jericho. That's the story you always hear, but there's going to be a lot more after that. Because next Sunday, Doris is going to teach, and there's more to come. What happened to Rahab and her family? Let's read about it, because we haven't read all the scriptures yet. Joshua said to the two men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her." It didn't just say family, all who belong to her, because they could have had some slaves and some others in there, but that's what they promised, everyone in that house. So the young men who had done the spying went in, and they brought Rahab and her father and her mother and her brothers and her sister and all who belonged to her. They brought out the entire family, put them in a place where?
Outside.
Outside the camp of Israel. There's no explanation about that, but we'll read later on that they will eventually be in the camp. Don't know what that was all about exactly. Not really said, but we do find out later on they were into the camp. What's the significance of the deliverance of Rahab and her household? Well, God is faithful to His word, and He's merciful. He's faithful to his word. He wanted to make sure that those spies went in there and kept this promise. And God will keep every promise that he makes to us. Scripture goes on to say, then they burned the whole city and everything in it, but they put the silver and the gold and the article of bronze and of iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. But Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she had hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. And she lives, what? Among the Israelites to this day. I felt better when I read that one after reading the first one. It says outside the camp. Not sure what that was about yet. Joshua puts a curse on anyone who tries to rebuild the city. Now, at that time, Joshua pronounced this solemn oath. Cursed before the Lord is the one who undertakes to rebuild this city, Jericho. He said, at the cost of his firstborn son, he will lay its foundations. At the cost of his youngest sons, he'll set up his gates. So the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. Nearly 700 years after Hiel of Bethel began rebuilding the city of Jericho, despite the curses placed on anyone who rebuilt the city, when he laid the foundation for the city, his firstborn child died. But he didn't stop. It's just as Joshua said. When he started rebuilding the gates, guess what happened? His youngest child died, just as the curse promised by Joshua. Now the city has been destroyed and been rebuilt several times. Today there is a city of Jericho. They're not sure it sits exactly on top because they've been doing a lot of archaeological digs in there, and I don't think it's under today's Jericho. Today the city of Jericho has a population of over 50,000 people, mostly Palestinians. It is governed by Fatah, which is a military group belonging to the National Palestinian Authority. So there is a Jericho today. But the first one to rebuild it, he lost his firstborn son and then his youngest, just as Joshua had said he would. What did we learn from today's lesson? The Israelites had to trust God and be obedient to his word. Yeah, they wanted to be obedient, but they probably had to think, why did you pick such a way? But after those walls came tumbling down, don't you know they felt good? Then they went running in there to carry out the rest of the instructions they had. You and I must do the same. We must trust and obey God. You don't have to understand why. God does not owe us answers to things. We just need to be faithful to him, even when it's not easy. Sometimes it's tough. Right now, I just admire Heidi and what she's doing in front of her kids. An example that she is setting. We know there's going to be a downfall a little later, but for right now, she's being strong, and her faith in God is in front of her kids and her grandkids right now. Trust.
You know, not just her family, but anybody that comes into contact with her, distant friends, whatever, and they see how it's like her daughter said, how are you doing?
And we need to tell her when we get her back in the class, how proud we are of her, that her faith was so strong, still is strong. That's our lesson for today. You get out almost 8 minutes early. Wait a minute, Charlie's going to talk for 8 minutes.
Okay. I wonder what the Israel soldiers thinking when they supposed to go in there and rescue